Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Hey, it is good to be with you guys here this morning. It is part 5 of our quarantine conversations. It is the last part in our series, and it's been a ride.
It has been
a great series. I want to welcome especially those of you guys who are new to the church, maybe new to church, period. Welcome here. Thank you so much. We've been getting such good replies from the first 4. And so really excited about that. Thanks for the engagement. If you want to know more about the church and you want to know more about us, if you check out our social media or our website, it gives you a pretty good idea.
mscc.church.
Yes.
No.
But to really get to know us, you're going to have to show up.
Yes.
I know you can tell from these sermons that we're not your average.
Yeah, you need to come. Yeah.
So we are hoping, we're actually very optimistic. We're actually hoping we're going to be open here shortly in a few weeks. Cases have gone down, numbers have plummeted in our region, which is awesome, great news. Schools are going back Monday.
Woohoo!
I know a lot of the teachers were pretty pumped about the fact that social media told them that.
Very exciting. Very exciting.
So clearly communication isn't the strongest, the strength of our government, but we will get to that in a little bit. Series recap, so if you've missed the first 4, we've talked about everything from civil disobedience and how you respond to a government when you don't agree. We talked about Mennonite myths, which was a lot of fun. There's a lot of misconceptions, and I bet you every minority in our region or anybody who comes from a different area, they kind of feel the same way. Like, people don't get us. And so we just had the opportunity to be able to present that. So Mennonite myths gives you a really good insight into actually what Mennonites are and understanding the diversity that there is among that. Then we talked about journeying through grief. And then last Sunday we talked about dealing with stress and anxiety. And so we really tried to pick things that we were actually dealing with through the pandemic. And this morning we are going to do the same.
Yes.
We are going to jump into part 5. But before we get that, today's guest is not really a guest at all. Patrick Stannett is one of our pastors on staff here.
There was just no one else who wanted to today. They were like, nope.
Yeah. Well, true story. We did try to get Jeff Urick on. I was trying to get him on to do an interview, but he ignored me, and I'm sure he'll respond tomorrow and be like, I'm a little bit too late.
Yeah.
So anyways, Patrick is here. The other thing we want to say, if you have enjoyed this conversation or these types of conversations, we are launching a podcast, hopefully middle of February.
Yes.
One of the things that we've realized throughout this pandemic is that there is a severe lack of platforms that discuss issues and have good articulated dialogue.
Yeah, if you haven't noticed, and I'm sure everybody has noticed, most conversations that are taking place out there are really narrative driven. People aren't actually, people are just talking at each other. They're not talking with each other. They're not trying to convince somebody on the other side of their argument. They just have their 5, 10 talking points, and it's just, I'm going to yell at you as fast as I can with my 10 talking points, and if I'm louder than you, then I win the argument, and everybody will post on there, hey, good job, you won. Our side was, but we actually did not dialogue. There was no movement on either side. Nobody could see the other person. Nobody could understand the other person. We don't think that's valuable at all. We think that has actually, as part of what we're going to talk about today, that's really dehumanized many people because you're not actually having a discussion with that person. You're just saying, hey, this is me, this is where I'm at. I'm not going to move. You need to come to my side, or you have no value. And we really want to start dialoguing with people and each other in a way that I think will inform people in a much more healthy way. Right,
and I think having other more local conversations about some of this stuff. What's it like raising family in a rural setting? There's so many things about being a parent that I had no idea that would be a fight. I didn't know picking a school would be a fight. I didn't even know there was a battle between vaccines and non-vaccines.
I didn't know that breakfast would be a fight.
If kids didn't have to eat or sleep, I think parenting would be a breeze, right? So there's all those types of issues. There's local issues. There's politics, and a lot of what we listen to ends up being stuff coming out of major centers. And realistically, anymore, a lot of it comes out of the States. And so we really feel like there's good use of dialogue that we can have here, talking about what life looks like in rural areas. And I think there's a lot of really awesome conversations that come out of that. So that's what we're doing. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, stay tuned. It's coming.
So this morning, part 4, we were supposed to address conflict resolution. And I think in some ways we still are. You could tell by the title that we've given this morning. We've titled it "Hatred, Healing, and Moving Towards Unity." we wanted to deal with conflict resolution. We want to talk about different approaches to that, and I think there will come a time for that yet. But as this month has kind of progressed, if I'm being completely honest, I kind of thought this whole fight in Elmer would long be done. Did you not?
I did not anticipate that it would keep growing, that it would develop in the direction that it's developed.
Right, like and it just when you think you have one thing figured out, then they escalate to another thing. And so we live in a small town, and somehow almost everybody around the world knows about what's happening here. We've been constantly in the news, and it has become a very divided town. I was talking to some business owners this week, just the challenges that this is presenting them, because the dialogue that has really come out of our town is that it's very much an us and them. And you're either with, and they've specifically said the Church of God, so it's not even like you're against mass or pro-mass, it's you're either for the Church of God or against the Church of God, and it's as if this argument is just black and white. And one of the things we want to say right up front this morning is that one of the reasons why we really feel there's a need for more articulate conversations is exactly what's happening in our town.
Yeah.
There is no us and them. There are a host of issues that people are disagreeing on. So let's just talk about two of them real quick. What we want to talk about before we get into all the other stuff is just, this is very complex.
Yeah.
And there is no us and them, because when there's an us and them, it creates a lot of really, really dark dynamics in our community. And we're actually seeing a lot of those playing out. So there is, let's talk about COVID regulations. I don't know anyone, I actually literally know of 0 human beings who agree fully with the government.
Yeah, if you were to go through that checklist and you were to go agree or disagree, I don't think every single person would be like, chick, yep, agree, we're good.
Right.
Nobody that I've talked to, nobody, doesn't matter what side of the spectrum they are, left, right, pro this, not pro that, doesn't matter what side they are, everybody's kind of like, well, I don't think that is the best approach for there. Right. Like, there is so much, it's so much more nuanced than just yes or no.
Right. And I think, often people are like, well, the Church of God, they're against the regulations, everyone else is for them, and that just hasn't been my experience. I think most people are pretty frustrated with various elements.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, people might not be witness to it here when we're sitting in front of each other, but there's definitely been a lot of disagreement even between us when it comes to how the government's handled different things, or how they've presented different things, or even how they've communicated different things. I mean, in our discussion, there's a lot, not just with, yes, I agree with what they're doing, and no, I don't, but there's, how they've brought out the regulation, when they implemented the regulation, the amount of warning they gave to businesses and different community things about the regulation, who they've left in charge of different things. Right. Is it going to be Southwestern Health, or is it going to be the government, or is it going to be the town, or is it going to be the city? There are so many more variables if we were to just step back and say, wow, this is a bigger topic than just, yes, I agree, or no, I don't. Right. And I think that's an important thing to...
Even with the masking thing.
Yeah.
Do you agree that we need masks outside? Like, there's so many different things that people are, and so to make it a black and white us and them has been really detrimental, and I think there's been a lack of good conversation on this. Why are they saying certain things? Why is this? And some of that has just been communication from the government. We've talked about this a lot. I think there's been a lacking, and anyone who disagrees with that obviously isn't a teacher. I know for me, was it Thursday when they announced it?
Yeah.
So I read Jeff Urick's post that schools were opening. So I go back to my wife, who's a teacher. I'm like, did you know? And she's like, we haven't been told squat. And then it starts trickling out that nobody was told. And so I think, I don't blame the government, because communication is hard.
Oh, yes.
We have a church of a couple hundred people, and we struggle to communicate. I get nailed for it all the time. Well, you guys didn't tell us. So I know communication is incredibly hard. But I think it's so crucial, and I know we're belaboring this point a little bit, but there isn't an us versus them. There is a us versus COVID. I want COVID to stop. And there may be a different viewpoint as to how that is. There may be a different viewpoint as to how a lot of those parts are. But to say there's a black and white us versus them, no. I think there's a huge spectrum. It's the same thing with religious freedom. That's another thing we've been talking about. Well, you're either for the Church of God. No, that's just not the way it is. There's a huge spectrum. We're going to get into this actually quite a bit at the end, but we both really, really believe in religious freedom. But our experience right now is that we as a church certainly have not been persecuted. The only thing that we have been withheld on is the fact that we cannot meet here all together in person.
Yeah, and in a general sense, that is true regardless of whether or not you're a place of faith or worship or not. And people can point to, well, Walmart is open, or this store is open. There's a lot of stores that aren't open that are big stores. That is that's a very nuanced conversation. Nobody's told me that I cannot read my Bible. Nobody's told me that I cannot pray. Nobody's told me that I cannot take care of my neighbor. Nobody has said that I cannot have conversations about my faith. There is so many things about my religious freedom that are still present. And matter of fact, in having discussions with government officials, they are actively working to make sure that the religious community, because they understand the religious community is very involved in the social fabric of our society in terms of backstopping it, in terms of needs, people who are in difficult situations, mental health needs, and be able to support those people in ways that the government just can't, because the government is not the answer. Right. So the community is the answer, and they recognize that, and they don't want to limit us from being able to partake in those activities which are beneficial to our society. Yeah. So to say that we are under some sort of extreme attack in comparison to any other, everybody everywhere is being asked to do the same thing.
Right. So let's jump ahead here a little bit. Today we wanted to address something that we felt was really, really important to talk about, and something that's really difficult to talk about.
Yeah.
There's those issues, and we do want to come back to that a bit at the end and talk about how we navigate some of that. But what we actually want to talk about today is hate. And hate is something that humanity has struggled with since the beginning. Hate is something that's written in our legislative code. We have, I should have written this down, what's that code of human rights? That lists specific things that you cannot treat people poorly based on some of this. Our government is trying to legislate the fact that we need to humanize each other. We need to care for each other. But we have taken every reason to hate people.
Yeah.
Like, to me, racism is still one of those things that blows my mind, that the color of a person's skin can somehow allow for hatred. Like, that is crazy that we have allowed that to become. But we as humans, we have an incredible capacity to love. Like, we can be amazing. Some of the acts that you're hearing about what people do for each other, unreal. But there is a dark side where our level of hatred and what we do in that hatred is astonishing. Yeah. And so as we're talking about, the situation in Elmer, and as we're talking about the divide and some of the anger that's leading to hatred in our community, this week we were thinking about this, and then Wednesday hit, and we were reminded that it was the International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
And Sarah Bloomfield, who you will likely not know, but she's the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She had this to say about it, and I think it's really pointed and well said. She says this, she says, this year, International Holocaust Remembrance Day comes at a pivotal point for our nation and the world. The Holocaust is a harsh reminder of the consequences of unchecked hatred and the fragility of societies. Its lessons have never been more relevant. Today, as we witness an alarming rise in anti-Semitism, racism, and neo-Nazism, we must recommit ourselves to learning those lessons and acting on them. That commitment to shaping the future is precisely what we owe the victims of the past. That line, she says, the Holocaust is a harsh reminder of the consequences of unchecked hatred, really, really stuck out to me.
Yeah.
That show of evil that we see in our history is something that we really, really need to learn from. And the reason that we are bringing this up in this conversation is that because a lot of people on different sides have begun to use the Holocaust as a way of spinning their own agenda and perspective on these arguments. And while it's not just been locally, I just want to read to you what Henry Hildebrandt told the London Free Press in January of this year in response specifically to this. He says, many Canadians need to read more history. And that I agree totally with him. But he says the Nazis did not start out with transporting Christians, the disabled, and Jews to the concentration camps. They came to power in 1933 and incrementally changed Germany's laws, conditioned the people, and normalized hate in order to facilitate the extermination of entire segments of the population nearly a decade later. Then he goes on to make the parallels and say what you're seeing our government do today is exactly what the Nazis were doing, and thus we must resist at every length because that's what they're doing. And I'm not an expert on the Holocaust. And I know Patrick is going to go into some more details, but it was a heavy week. We spent quite a bit of time because if somebody's going to throw out something like the Holocaust, I want to go back and I want to hear from the survivors, and I want to hear. And so we did a lot of that. And we listened to a lot of stories. And what we saw in that and what we read in Henry's post is that the very thing that they agree is at the core, they themselves aren't acknowledging. See, what Henry said in his post, if you read it, he said that it wasn't the regulations that were the issue. It wasn't the government rules that were the issue. It was that people became conditioned to hate. It was people starting to justify hatred, and that hatred led them to dehumanizing others, and when the others became dehumanized, it was then that their actions seemed okay in their minds. It was the acceptance of hatred. The acceptance that another wasn't worthy of dignity, wasn't worthy of love, and ultimately wasn't worthy of life. The Holocaust is a dark and terrifying moment that teaches us that hatred can never be accepted. And what we're seeing in Elmer and what we're feeling, especially from some of those who are anti-government right now, is a strong hatred that we need to hate the police and we need to hate the government officials. And at the very core of what he himself said, it was that conditioning to normalize hatred that was actually at the root of it. And so this morning, as we're talking, we want to actually just talk about hate. And we want to get to a place where we say we can never be okay with hating another being. Now, we know the difference. Hate, I know we throw words around a lot, right? I hate the Maple Leafs. I hate this. But we're talking about deep hatred. You know the difference. We're not talking about just disagreeing. We're not talking about just, not liking somebody's perspective. We're talking about hating another human being. Hating them because they're a part of a certain church. Hating them because of their profession. Hating them because of their viewpoints. That hate is dangerous and it's wrong, and it's something that all of us on every side of this argument should come together and say, we may not agree, but what we can never be okay with is hatred of another human being, because the consequences of hate are never good. And so we want to actually, because we think it's crucial that we remember. And so what we want to do is we actually go through some of the details, and I've asked Patrick to put together some of the key thoughts about the Holocaust. And some of this is going to be hard, and it's heavy, and it's been heavy for us. But we need to remember. We need to remember our past. We need to learn from it and ensure that we never repeat it.
The events of the Holocaust, without question, are horrific. It would only take you a few moments to go on to YouTube and to type in Holocaust survivor interview to be able to listen to a real person's perspective on what took place that day. And honestly, we should never, and I say never, we should be very, very, very careful when we ever pull out the term Nazi, Holocaust, and this is just like that. We should never, that should be so far from our lips. In going through the last number of days and spending hours reading and watching and listening, the events of today are not at all like the events in time that took place in Europe in those days, in the early 1930s. It's not at all. There is no parallel to today. And whenever you hear somebody pull out a reference to Hitler, to Nazi, to Germany, to Holocaust, you need to be very careful whether or not you're going to be willing to listen to that person again, because the depth of the hatred and what was done in those days is just, it's unmatched to what we've seen today.
Right, and again, we want to separate here. There were rules that the German government put in place. We agree with this.
Yeah.
But the choice to allow hatred to become normalized is on us.
Yeah. And what we saw then is that a certain group of the population became targeted.
Right.
And we're not seeing a targeted group today.
No.
So with that being said, this is not a complete overview. It's impossible. You can't even take one person's interview and life experience and be able to give it any semblance of dignity by discussing it in the short period of time that we have. So let's be very clear about that. But we're going to go through some points that kind of lead us through what took place to just give us some points to remember and to give us a little bit of perspective of what took place in those days. So we'll begin. I've chosen a few pictures to go along with some of these points. So some of them might be difficult to view, but I think it's good for us to have to face some difficult things. So the Holocaust was a state-sponsored mass murder of millions of Jewish people, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and other persecuted groups by the Nazi regime during World War II. The word comes from the Greek word holocauston, which refers to a sacrifice by fire. While a majority of the killings occurred from 1941 to 1945, Jews were persecuted by the Nazi regime starting in 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. Jewish people were excluded from public life on September 15, 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were issued. These laws also stripped German Jews of their citizenship and their right to marry other Germans. What took place was Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And this occurred on November 9th, 1938. Nazis pillaged, burned synagogues, broke windows of Jewish-owned businesses, and attacked Jewish people in Austria and Germany. 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Starting in 1939, the Nazi government ordered all Jewish people to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing. The tactic isolated Jews from the rest of society and made it easier for them to be identified and targeted. Following Germany's invasion of Poland, Jews were forced to live in confined areas called ghettos, sometimes sealed off from the rest of the city by fences or barbed wire. There they faced shortages of food and medicine and the constant fear of being deported to concentration camps. The Nazis constructed over 44,000 incarceration sites, which included detention centers, forced labor camps, and specifically designed killing centers. They functioned independent of any judicial review, and torture, starvation, and mass murder were frequent. Approximately 6 million Jewish people, 6 million, died during the Holocaust, and nearly a third of them died within a span of 3 months during the killing campaign Operation Reinhardt. Ultimately, 2/3 of all Jewish people living in Europe during World War II were killed by the Nazi regime. In addition, millions of other individuals were also killed during the Holocaust, including Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, LGBTQ people, and people with disabilities. The United Nations designated January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The date marks the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau death camps in 1945. In 1953, the Knesset, or Israel's parliament, made Yom HaShoah a national holiday to remember those murdered during the Holocaust and recognize the achievements of its survivors and refugees. It occurs on the 27th day of the month of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar. Today, Yom HaShoah is also observed abroad, typically by Jews at synagogues and other community events. Being educated on the Holocaust not only means we grasp the tragic events of those days, but we also decide to leave our hatred behind. We would ask you to join us in a moment of silence as we remember the tragic consequences and the effects of hatred that was left unchecked and what it had and its impact on our world.
it's hard to see that last picture because it gives you some perspective. 11 and a half years of silence. So when we throw around the term Nazism, when we throw around the term Holocaust, when we throw around loosely these words to spin our own agenda, I think it's both insulting to those who truly suffered, and I think it's also incredibly manipulative. I think for us as humans, I think it's also incredibly important for us to remember it, and it is a dark side of history, but it is a time when hatred went unchecked. And this isn't the only example. I wish we could look back at human history and say, this is the only example, but you see this. You see this in so many genocides, and you see humanity having the capacity to just be evil. And so I think for us, especially coming from the church, we need to make a push that I'm not Doug Ford. I cannot force him to change his mind, but what I can do is I can live my life in a way to spread a message of hope, spread a message of faith, and to never allow that type of hatred to become okay. Regardless of how I see things, regardless of who I vote for, regardless of my profession.
And regardless of who it's directed towards.
Absolutely. Because then that was part of Holocaust history, was there was already an underlying hatred of the Jews.
Yeah, and as you can see, an underlying hatred of other people groups within society as well. That people, and again, being very careful how we say this, we're looking for a reason or an okay just to get rid of them.
And so I think that's where we need to really look at giving every human dignity, giving every human value. And as soon as we begin to strip that away, I'm not going to go to the extreme and say we're going to become Nazis, because sometimes we kill people with our words just because we hate them. And I think we have to be so careful in the way we see. And so we want to kind of transition this to how do we respond? How do you battle back against this? Because the disagreement in Elmer is not going to end. Both sides have dug their heels in far enough that I don't see the protesters on the one side of the road and the church on the other side of the road ending. And online, I don't see this coming to a place where they finally go, we see the same. So how do you respond? And you know, after COVID is gone, there's going to be other arguments. And there's going to be other things. So how do we respond in these moments? And I think for me, at least, especially, I can't tell anyone outside of faith what they're supposed to do. But in faith, we have some pretty clear direction from Scripture as to what type of mindset and attitude we're supposed to have. And that's, I think, what we want to talk about. Jesus used this really cool metaphor. He talks about how our tendency is to always look at others and try to fix them. And so he uses the saying, he's like, you're always looking at your neighbor and you're like, hey, you got a little speck in your eye. I should get rid of that for you. And he's like, but you're not dealing with the 2x4 you have in your own eye. Like we have this ability to constantly be looking at everybody else. And I think the conversation today, we can talk about hatred and we can talk about all this stuff that other people are doing. But I think today, really, we want to have more of a mirror type of sermon, a mirror type of conversation to go, okay, what part am I playing in this? There's a ridiculous sign that I think it's ridiculous, but the firefighters use, and it's like, I got the big bear up there, and it's like, only you can prevent forest fires.
Forest fires.
And I always laugh at that. I'm like, I don't feel like only I can. I feel like, but the principle behind it is every person has to do their part. And unless every person does their part, and I think that's how we need to do this, we can't change everybody else around us. Parenting, you learn that. You can't force your kids. The biggest thing you learn you need to change when you're a parent is you. I have no patience. Right? And so as we're going through this, really have this conversation, okay, well, what part am I playing in this? Is my life exuding hope? Is my life exuding love? Is my life exuding Christ? And so what we wanted to do in the time we have left is we want to look at specifically our mind and renewing our mind, because so much of this begins in our thoughts. And so I want to start here. And part of the reason why we started here was because of what happened to me this week. So we started a course that we launched, Inspired Discipleship. So people in our church, you guys will know that. Really excited. We got 22 people plus Patrick and myself in the course. So excited, so thrilled. So we finally get going. And the first day of the journal, we're supposed to pick a character trait that we want to work on. And so Pam, who wrote this, had a list of character traits. And so I flipped over it, and again, I'm in the middle of really the difficulty of this topic. And the first word is thoughts. And I said, I don't even need to read the rest, because I know this is exactly where I need to work.
Yeah.
Because this week was a hard week, and because people are so sick of lockdown, and they're so sick of COVID, and they're so sick of everything, and the theories are just getting heavier. And there's so much this week, at least from people that I know, posting stuff about the Holocaust, and how this is all pointing towards that. And it was heavy.
Yeah.
It was really heavy. And so I had, as soon as it was thoughts, I was like, oh man, that's definitely where I need to go. And there's a verse, a set of verses in the book of Philippians that my mind went to right away. So if you're not familiar with Scripture, the New Testament, there's a bunch of letters by one of the early church leaders named Paul, and he writes to the church in Philippi. And so in chapter 4, he says this: most of all, friends, always rejoice in the Lord. I never tire of saying it. Rejoice. And I think I'm going to break this down just a little bit as I'm talking here, the little preaching.
Are you going to get preachy?
I might get a little, but
Yeah.
you know, I want to put a challenge out to those of you who say God is good.
Yeah.
Paul is just going, look, this is written to those who are already claiming God is good. If you claim God is good, then rejoice in that. We need to lead with that joy. We can't get sucked into the same darkness and emptiness, because we're the ones who claim God is good. We're the ones who say God is bigger than all this. We're the ones who say all of this. And so I love the way Paul is writing here. He's like, listen, always rejoice in the Lord. I never tire of saying it, rejoice. And he says, keep your gentle nature so that all people will know what it looks like to walk in his footsteps. What a powerful statement to both sides right now.
Yeah.
For those of you who are followers of Jesus, keep your gentle nature so that all people will know what it looks like to walk in his footsteps. The Lord is ever present with us. That's what we believe. Don't be anxious about things. Instead, pray. Pray about everything. He longs to hear our requests. So talk to God about your needs and be thankful for what has come. I cannot help but wonder as I was reading this, the amount of time I've wasted on reading about all these theories and COVID and all. What if I had, because again, I believe in God. I believe that he is real. I believe that he hears our prayers. What if I had spent that much time praying for our leaders? What if I had spent that much time praying for our frontline workers? What if I had spent that much time actually advocating on their behalf to the God that I believe is the one who's going to get us through this?
Yeah.
But it's interesting how quickly we get sucked into this darkness. But what if all the church, despite the fact that we can't gather here, we're determined that we will read our scriptures and get to know them better, that we will meditate on that word, and we will pray and pray and pray. And that says, and to know that the peace of God, a peace that is beyond any and all of our human understanding, will stand watch over your hearts and minds in Jesus, the Anointed One. See, what I love about God is that he doesn't just tell us to ignore our emotions and our feelings. And he doesn't tell us that you can't be anxious. He just tells us what to do with it.
Yep.
You need to pray, because there are things that are going to be out of your control, i.e. COVID. And when those things face you, they're out of your control, you need to pray. And then I'm going to give you a peace that is beyond anything you can understand, because our brain, the only way we can have peace is when everything's peaceful.
Yeah.
But God says, no. When you know me, I'm going to give you peace that's beyond what you can ever comprehend. All right, and then it gets to the part about the mind. And I had to read that as a bit of context, but it says, finally, brothers and sisters, now listen to this real carefully. Fill your minds with beauty and truth. Meditate on whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is good, whatever is virtuous and praiseworthy. It seems that so many are getting stuck in all the conspiracies And maybe some of those are going to come true. I don't know. But what Paul tells the reader here, and those readers, again, they were suffering. I mean, when you look back at the Old Testament, if you really want to get some context on this, I mean, there was a lot of suffering. These were not a free people. They did not have a good government. They were already living in dark times, and Paul just says that you need to focus on what you know. If you spend all the time focusing on the what ifs, and that's where you land, you're going to end up despaired, discouraged, disheartened. And he says, so instead, I want you to fill your minds with beauty and truth. And I couldn't stop with that, because this lockdown, as much as it's been dark, I've never been able to spend so much time with my kids.
Right.
I have loved seeing them develop. I have loved seeing them learn new things and be challenged and stretched. I have loved being able to actually have evenings free.
Yeah, isn't that wild?
Right?
Yeah.
And weekends, like this Sunday afternoon, we're like, well, what plans we got? Nothing. Like, we've never had this before. And to enjoy that and enjoy the time together, I think it's so easy for us to look around and go, well, I can't do this. And I was thinking, I shared this a little while ago, again, going back to the very beginning of Scripture, there's a story about Adam and Eve in the garden, and God says, you can eat of any tree, you can do whatever you want, just there's this one thing I don't want you to do. And you know exactly what they did. And I feel like that's where our brains have been. There's this thing that you can't do, and so all we can focus on is that, and there's all this freedom and all this joy that we can have that we're missing. And Paul says to the readers here, he's like, fill your minds with beauty and truth. Because I'm telling you, what you fill your mind with is who you're going to become.
Yep.
And if you fill your mind with hatred and just negativity constantly, it's who you're going to become. When they talk about Hitler conditioning people, it's in what you take in. And so the government may be trying to get us to be a certain way. I'm not going to say one way or another. I'm not that smart. What I can tell you is that I'm going to fill my minds with things that are beautiful and true. And I'm going to spend time meditating, not just thinking quickly, but meditating on what is honorable and right and pure and lovely, whatever is good and virtuous and praiseworthy. And I think people of faith, we've lost this. Mm-hmm. And we've become an advocacy group instead of the church.
Yep.
And we have felt like during this, so many of the conversations, it's like we're the ones who are supposed to tell the politicians what to do. No, that's not our role. We've lost being the church. And I just want one more thought on this, and then we'll start wrapping it up here a little bit before I go too long and pull up Patrick. There's another passage in Romans, a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome. Just listen to what he says here. He says, brothers and sisters, in light of all I have shared with you about God's mercies, again, knowing all you do about how much God loves you, about how God has carried people through all of history, about how much he cares deeply for you as an individual. So knowing all that, I urge you to offer your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice to God. A sacrifice offering that brings him pleasure. This is your reasonable and essential worship. And I loved the use of the word essential in here because that has changed for us.
Yeah. Oh, it has.
You want to talk about essential worship? Paul goes, this is essential worship. And he says, don't allow the world to mold you into its own image. Instead, be transformed from the inside out by renewing your mind, filling your minds with things that are true and beautiful. As a result, you will be able to discern what God wills and whatever God finds pleasing, finds good, pleasing, and complete. And I would just challenge those of you guys who are of faith, and even those of you guys who aren't. Fill your minds with things that are good and true. When we allow so much negativity to reign, the consequence in our society is dark. So, with that, to us as a church, individually, our theme for the year is gratitude.
Yes.
And so I want to challenge you guys on specifically is to spend some time asking yourself the question, am I grateful? And if not, why not? Because if you live in Southern Ontario, you have a long list of things to be grateful for.
Yeah, I think it's a good exercise. And I mean, we've said it before, say it again. Take out a piece of paper, take out a pen, and start listing all the things, all the people, everything you're grateful for. Yeah. It's a really, really big list.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just need to go through the exercise of putting it before our face so that we can remember just how incredible of a life we have right now, today, in the midst of quarantine, lockdown, and all the stuff that's going on around us, and how crazy the world's been for the last 12 months. We could argue a lot longer than that.
We could.
But it's pretty incredible, the life that we get to live,
right.
the people we get to spend our time around, the neighbors that surround us. There are so many amazing things. And we need to be reminded.
And when you go around the world, you begin to realize that, I was talking to Benny and Esther, who are good friends of ours, who are missionaries in Bolivia. When you look at the situation there, when they go to lockdown, this is not like there's a social relief program. For many of those people, it is, if I don't work today, I don't eat today. To have what we have here, yes, am I worried about at some point there being a reckoning of the way the finances have been spent? Yes. I'm sure at some point something's got to give. But we have the ability, if you are unemployed, there is money for you right now. There are shelters. Our food bank, just consider this, our food bank in Elmer right now is so full they actually don't completely know what to do with all the food.
And I think people need to also view that and go, wow, there's a lot of generous people out there. The world has a lot of good people in it that are trying to do their best to love each other. And that's an incredible thing that we need to remember. It's so easy to just see one group or one person or one thing and just focus on that and go, But it is incredible with how generous people have been and how people are stepping out to love each other and to care for each other. I mean, just the other day, I was so encouraged to see my neighbor across the street shoveling his neighbor's laneway to take care of them. And I just, you do more good by doing an act of kindness like that than you ever could from pointing out with vitriol and hurt something online. There's so many things to be thankful for right in our backyard.
And so many of those things are just little things.
Yeah.
But they make such a world of a difference. Okay, so with that, we're going to transition to having a bit of fun.
Free for all? Is that what we're doing? What are we doing?
What we wanted to do today is, so one of the things that we really feel strongly about is that there is a lack of conversation.
Yeah.
And so there are issues specifically in Elmer here that people are not discussing, and they're just screaming at each other, exactly like what Maddie commented on there, just yelling at each other. So what we want to do is we want to share some of our opinions on some of the stuff that's going. Yeah. So this is not going to be preaching. I want to be very clear on this. This is going to be us giving a few opinions and some thoughts as people who are very engaged in our community. And so if you disagree with them, again, send all your hate mail to abeberg@gmail.com.
Yeah. He's really good with receiving it.
He really does. Yeah. He really does.
He's a good man.
So we want to talk about three different things, and this is coming back to what we said at the beginning. We want to talk a little bit about COVID regulations, specifically the battles going on in Elmer. Some thoughts. The second is we want to talk a little bit about religious freedom. And finally, we want to address something that's been a bit new and that is the big push to call the Church of God a cult, and what we do with that. So let's start with COVID regulations. I wrote some notes here quickly.
Oh, you did? Because you were nervous, eh?
I'm not nervous, but I also...
What was Patrick going to say?
Right. COVID
regulations. Let's start right from the top. Let's just get it out of the way. There is no question that Albert and I do not agree on all the different regulations that are taking place. Like, we don't. I
don't think you guys, there have been days where we kind of get mad at each other in the office, and we kind of have to go. So one of the things, because when we come up here often, and we have certain things that we strongly agree on, and those are things we want to talk about, because I think are some of the crucial ones. And I think in resolving conflict often, if you can find the things that you actually agree on, then at least it's just not us and them. It's okay, here's the things that we see the same. And here's the things that we see differently, and it allows for really good conversation. I've been really richly blessed by it. I really actually enjoy it. I grew up in a home where we discussed politics a lot, and I've learned to enjoy that. And sometimes during the fight, it's not enjoyable, because Patrick gets really wound up, and then I get really wound up, and then... So anyways, we want to talk about a couple different things with that. The one is, we wanted to talk about the perspective of both sides being on the side of science.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you follow the arguments as much as we do.
The science says...
Both sides.
Yeah.
and both sets of politicians, and on every side, both claim that they are doing what they're doing because of science. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that science is always black and white.
Yeah.
You're either for science or you're against science. Again, it's not like that. And one of the things that we've learned during COVID, and a true scientist would totally agree with this, is that science is a process of learning, and there are very few things that are black and white.
Yeah.
If they knew black and white about COVID, everybody would be taking the same approach. But they don't.
No, they don't. You can look around at every country around the world, and there is such a spectrum and variety of approaches that are being taken. And we can point to all different types of people groups. Like, why aren't we doing it like them? Well, different people, different culture, different makeup of their society, different numbers of people, whether it's elderly, whether it's a diversity of the ethnic group in that culture, whether it's just how their borders are open or closed, whether they can shut down their borders, whether they're an island to themselves or they're adjacent to other nations, how those connections impact their food supply, their energy supply, and all those things, because all those things are taken into consideration when it comes to their economy, their society, how they feed people. So their decisions are so varied because of all those things, and we can, well, let's do it like them. Well, it's not as simple as just saying, well, look at that, and then the science behind the decisions that they made, that's variable too. Because we don't know what strain is over there. We don't know the demographic of those people per se. We just hear this one fact and we go, that's the way we should be doing it.
But you see, even in Ontario, so when this latest lockdown hit, there was a bunch of doctors who came out and said, we disagree. But there was a bunch of doctors who agree.
Yeah.
And so when you're going to make arguments, again, about this, I'm all for the dialogue.
Yeah.
Should we be wearing masks outside? I don't understand it. But I'm also, I live in Mount Salem. I graduated high school. I did decent. But I don't know all the arguments. I don't know all the reasons. But to just blindly say, well, because science says, science has actually not been very clear. And in a lot of things, science is not. The scientists are constantly learning and they're studying. But it is not this thing where everything is black and white. And I think when you put that into your arguments, I think you just shut down conversation. Well, I believe in science, right? I think of Nacho Libre, right?
Yeah.
You kind of... No?
Got to come back to
Naturally. So I think that's one of the things with science we just want to say is if you're going to use it, A, use trusted sources, and B, understand that not all scientists agree on almost any aspect of this. I think there's a few things they agree on, and that's why you see that in every country. Social distancing is one thing you see basically everywhere.
Yeah.
They've all agreed on that. And so just be careful in how you're wording that. And again, if you're looking for dialogue, you can do this. But if you're just looking to slam somebody, you see it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, if you disagree with me, you must not believe in science. Well, it's not a fair conversation to have, right? So,
usually those things are only used or pulled out of the bag when you want the other person to be quiet.
Right.
You don't want to actually have a conversation. You just want to slam down the science and then we're done.
Right.
And it's interesting because a lot of times if we were to associate this to faith backgrounds, a lot of people would pull out their Bible verse and slam it down on the table because they don't want to talk about it anymore.
100%.
And now we're doing the exact same thing with the science. Boom.
Yep.
So you can see that humanity is very consistent with how they want to have discussion and conversation. You be quiet, listen to what I have to say, let's move on.
Right. We struggle in marriage with that, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, we have conversations, but she's always right.
Yeah.
Right? So that's just how
100%.
that works. So, second thing I want to talk about with this is, so we grew up and we are in a nation where we don't talk about politics. Like, we've always been told, you don't talk about politics. We live in a region here where you have almost nobody running for council. That there's very little engagement. And now all of a sudden COVID hits. Now everybody's angry and fired up. Where were you when the elections were going?
Where are you right now when you can join in on Zoom meetings to
Right?
follow along what's the decisions being made in your community?
When's the last time you showed up to a council meeting? I can tell you when the last time I was, and it's more than 37 years ago. And I'm 37. So there's a piece of this where there's a ton of hypocrisy coming from our end where we're like bashing the politicians, but we don't want to be engaged in the process. I don't want to run for council. I don't want to do that. Good night. I don't want to do that. Okay, but if you don't want to do that, and you don't want to be held responsible for those decisions, don't be that shocked when your voice isn't heard. So when the next elections come up, I sure hope in Elmer and Malahide there are a ton of people applying because there have been a ton of people complaining. And so I think there's a little bit of, it fires me up a little bit because we're armchair quarterbacks.
Yeah.
You know what, if I were Doug Ford, you know what, I struggle to lead the little church that I have. If I were Doug Ford, I would be so stressed, I probably would have resigned. Like, I can understand why those politicians flew to Mexico. I don't agree with it, but I can definitely understand it. It's stressful.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're going to complain, you got to be a part of it. Put yourself out there.
And let's not be afraid to have discussions surrounding
100%.
decisions that are being made
Yep.
for the direction of where we're going as a community and society.
Right.
We should be okay with discussing things, even if we disagree. Let's have those conversations. We can actually have conversations. It's when conversations are not allowed and discussion is, we're just yelling at each other and we
Yep.
can't actually talk, that's a bad situation to
Right.
be in. If you're in an environment, wherever it is, if it's in your university, if it's at your kitchen table, if it's anywhere, then we need to be able to have dialogue.
Right.
We need to be able to talk with each other.
Right.
It's a very important thing.
So 2 more things I want to touch on here real quick. Appropriate advocacy. If you don't like the laws right now, I'm a big fan of you dealing with it the right way. And actually, if you understand our Canadian system, we actually have a pretty good system. So the government can make laws, but the courts actually have the ability to go in and wait, that's not constitutional, that's not right, that needs to change. If you're opposed to a lot of things they're doing, there's guys in Elmer. One of the guys that I follow is Paul Morrison, who is a lawyer in Elmer here, but some really good insight that I would never have thought of. And so go to people who are actually in the law and ask them the questions. Because a lot of us, I get the basics of the way our system is set up, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't work in the depths of it. I don't understand all the things. And so go to the appropriate people and do the appropriate advocacy. If you want to protest some of these changes, I'm a big fan of it. Just do it right. Don't just try to create attention for yourself. If all you're trying to do is attention seek, that's not how you make change. Promoting hate is not going to make change.
Right.
That's just not the way that's going to go. And so for those of you guys, especially in our church, if you want to fight against this, that's cool. I think part of what makes Canada beautiful is our right to disagree with the government. Do it the right way. Don't do it with gossip. Don't do it with hate. Don't do it with slander. If you want to disagree with Justin Trudeau, become a part of that. Send in your stuff. Go see Karen Vecchio. If you don't like what Doug Ford is doing, go see Jeff Yerrick. Have those conversations. Send your emails. Do all that stuff.
Yeah.
But you can't dehumanize them and treat them like garbage just because you disagree with their opinion. And that frustrates me when I see people online absolutely trashing somebody like Jeff or Karen, and both of whom I've really come to appreciate.
Yeah, they have been nothing but supportive and understanding and willing to have conversation.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing. We'll post anything that we want to post, but we will not send them an email or write them a message and have that dialogue. And that's just not right. We need to be able to have those conversations directly to those people so that we can, that's what the process is. Yep. It's there for a reason. So we have that, and we should be willing to follow it.
Right, 100%. All right, so let's go to the second one, religious freedom. And again, all of these are topics that Patrick and I have talked for a good 10, 15 hours on, but we want and think everyone should care for religious freedom to remain free in Canada. Yeah. Whether you're atheist, Buddhist, Muslim, whatever you are, part of what makes Canada beautiful is the ability to be able to think and choose whom you should worship. The Christian faith, we have a history of sometimes thinking that maybe we can force everybody else to become Christian.
Yep,
that does not work well.
No.
And we don't want to live in that kind of a country. And I think whether you're atheist or a person who believes that God exists, all of us should value the ability to think freely. And I think as we're having that conversation, so with that as a backdrop, we totally agree with that. I think it's crucial. I think we also need to be careful how quickly we throw the word persecution around.
Yeah.
We've touched on this already, so we're not going to touch on it long, but we as churches have just not been persecuted. I've made multiple statements about this throughout the entire time. The government, even with this lockdown, is allowing what's happening right here.
Yeah.
He's allowed us to be able to gather at the church, minimum or maximum 10 people, for a service so that we can record, we can live stream, we can do this. They have made exemptions, they have made exceptions to allow this to happen. The government, if anything, has been too awesome to churches.
Yeah.
And so when we throw the word around, we're being persecuted. Well, persecution, then everybody is. Baseball is shut down, hockey is shut down, concerts are shut down, all those things. So if we want to argue that those things should be opened, cool, let's have that conversation. But don't drag the religious freedom into it, because I've had full freedom to worship. I've had full freedom. And some of the stuff people are posting online, the freedom to be able to disagree so strongly with the government, and you're not seeing a crackdown. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, and some of you guys probably won't like it, but what happened to the Church of God last Sunday was nothing more than a cry for attention.
Yeah.
That was not about religious freedom. to bring everybody into the building is just not about advocating freedom. That is about getting attention, and it is a terrible example of a shepherd bringing his people, his flock, into danger. And then when the police go hand out the tickets that Henry knew they would hand out, then we cry religious persecution. That's garbage and it needs to stop. That is not religious persecution. If you want to see religious persecution, talk to some of our friends in China. Talk to some of our friends in these nations where they're actually being persecuted. We need to be careful on those words because what we are experiencing is not that. And when we cry wolf and it's not real, it does incredible damage to the ministry of the church, and it does incredible damage to the witness of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Our job right now is to love and to care and to we should be protecting our people, not putting them into harm's way.
Yeah.
I'm disgusted at what's happening there. I'm angry about what's happening there. And it needs to stop.
Yeah, when our neighbors are experiencing the exact same regulations and rules that we are as people of faith, that's not persecution.
No.
No single group is being singled out by our government, and we are all being asked.
Right.
And then when we as a people say, not us,
right,
that's a terrible testimony.
Right.
What we're really saying is not me.
Right.
Don't do that to me. And when you start talking like things like that, then you start entering into pride. You start entering into don't take away my rights. And when you previously used the verse, we're supposed to lay ourselves down as a living sacrifice. Right. We as a people of faith need to lead out in being willing to lay ourselves down for the betterment of those around us. Right. Not stand up with our fists held up and fight for what isn't there.
Yep.
Like we are not under attack.
And again, be the church. Not an advocacy group.
Right.
If you want to be an advocacy group, then go be an advocacy group, but that is not being the church, and we need to go back to being the church. And that leads us into this last one. There's been a lot of conversation about whether the Church of God is a cult. And I don't want to answer that question because I think people have the ability to research for themselves. What I do want to address is the Christians and how we respond to this. So if the Church of God is a cult, that does not justify any hatred, any slander, in any way, shape, or form demeaning those people, because those people, I disagree with what Henry is doing, and I've been very vocal on that. But there are beautiful people in that church, and there are amazing people in that church. So if you believe it's a cult, then you should love them more than ever. Care for them. If you know anything about cult culture, you'll understand that persecuting them is exactly feeding their narrative. So all the protesters sitting across the road are feeding their narrative. They believe they're going to be persecuted. So when you go and you persecute, if you think that's being beneficial, you're just misunderstanding what they're all about.
And we do understand. We don't want to say that those that are there having their right to say that what's going on is wrong.
Sure.
We don't want to dismiss that, but we also recognize that there's a lot of fear right now about how people are hurting each other and mistreating each other, and we recognize that. But we also see from an outside almost perspective from this argument that says, take the wood out of the fire here and let it burn out. Your presence is not needed there. It's only adding exactly the fuel that this individual wants to have added. Right. Then they can actually say, look, what we said was going to happen is happening. Right. And we're only feeding into that narrative that wants to be pushed instead of being able to have the dialogue that's needed. So if you're a neighbor to someone who's there, have that dialogue. Right. Be able to have those conversations, be able to talk with them, be able to love them and be that light that they need you to be.
But again, and that goes back to our point of you cannot dehumanize them because you disagree with them.
Right.
And if you love them and you really care for them and you are worried that they're in a cult, the way you respond is going to make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And so for those of us who are followers of Jesus, it is our job as leaders to lead our flock and to call out false teaching. But beyond that, we are never justified to hate. And so I would strongly encourage you guys, don't buy into the boycotts and don't buy into all that kind of stuff. You want to love on people. If you want true change, it's going to happen with love. If you want to convince them that their perspective is wrong. There has to be love and mutual respect, at least to the extent that we're both human and we both want dignity and we both want to be loved. And so regardless of where you stand on that, we cannot allow that kind of hatred that we are seeing towards this group to be okay. I can disagree with Henry, but that does not mean and give me the right to hate him. And I know that is something that is sometimes, it's a fine line. It's hard to walk. Mm-hmm. But I think it's crucial that we keep fighting back and going, I will not allow myself to hate. I will dialogue, I will think through, because we will get to the other side, and that's, I guess, the way we want to end. We are convinced that we are going to come out the other side. Mm-hmm. And what is the story that you want to be told about what your life looked like during this? What is the lesson you want to be teaching your kids as they're watching you navigate this? And my hope is that for the Church of Jesus Christ, the worldwide church, is that we exemplify faith, hope, and love. Yep. And a love for God, and a belief that he gives us hope, and a faith that he's going to carry us through. But then also a hope that we instill in others, not fear. And a love that we care deeply about others. And I think as we model that, I think it allows us to get past hatred. It allows us to learn a lot of the lessons from the past and move towards deeper unity. So, let me check quickly. Is there anything we're supposed to, we're good? No questions? All right, so food for thought. Again, those are our opinions. This is where we feel about that. Again, I don't think my voice has any weight beyond the church that has allowed me to be a part of the leadership, and so that's who we're talking really to. Everyone else listening, man, I love that you guys are engaged. I would encourage you in your circles to engage in these conversations. Yeah. Don't just trust our word, engage in it. If you live people who are next to people who are anti-mask or pro-mask, find ways to engage. Why do you believe what you believe? What are the things? What are the fears? And so when Patrick and I talk about disagreeing so much, it's because some of our circumstances are different. Yep. Your parents are a lot older than mine are. Yep. You're at a different stage in life. But also your experiences prior to this are different. Depending on what your experience has been with government, it's going to be different. Depending on what your trust is on the police, it's going to be different. And so understand that people are different, but when we can understand each other, I think it allows for dialogue, but it also becomes a buffer against hatred. And I think hatred is something we need to battle against so strongly. So in closing, what I want to say is just to those of you guys who are still on the front lines, we are praying for you. Yeah. I know there are people in our church who are police officers and nurses and doctors and other frontline workers. I think of the truckers who are going across the border constantly. I think of our construction workers. There's so many of you guys who are out there who are still on the front lines. We're praying for you. We are really proud of the way you guys are representing the church where you're at. And for the rest of our community listening, man, I still love being in this community. And I know that at some point this is going to end, and when it does, I think we're going to be a better community for it. And so let's keep pushing towards love. Let's lead in love. Patrick, if you want to close in prayer, and we'll shut her down.
Thank you, God, for your amazing grace and love towards us. Thank you for demonstrating that to us each and every day. Thank you that we get to live in such an amazing country with such amazing people that surround us. And thank you for all the diversity of people around us, and for how much color and how much content they add to every conversation. And thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Thank you that we can enjoy, God, our everyday. Help us, God, to have our eyes open to those around us that have needs, and help us to love first in our homes to each other, to our neighbors that live right next door, to our streets and our communities around us. Help us to change those areas, God, and by each one of us doing that, we can change our entire community. We can change our entire town. We can change our entire province. God, help us to each do our part. And we'll give you thanks for that. Thank you for loving us. I love you. And we just want to say thank you, God. We have so much to be thankful for. In Jesus' name, amen.
Have a great week. Thank you so much for joining us.